It's pretty what it comes about this side. Yes, I remember that. Have another one. I think I did. That's the one. Yeah. I came with my dad.
So we're celebrating the publication of The Politics of Waking Up, and I'm just going to read a little bit about a blurb about the book, and I won't say too much because I know it's going to come out in conversation with Indra and Zoya. Everyone thinks that they know what it means to be woke, whether they're declaring it or attacking it. Indra has written a comprehensive and necessary account of waking up to the realities of climate crisis, social breakdown and personal agency implicating us all. In the internet era, no one escapes the global revolution of learning, connecting and mobilising. The Politics of Waking Up offers us a story of a new possible with a coherent, radical alternative to our current social, political turbulence. And I feel straight after the conversation with Kate, this is like a timely conversation tying in some of the things, Kate, that you've talked about with the 7 principles. And on that note, I'll hand over to Indra and Zoya. Thank you.
So there was a section of the book on page 56 about this moment that I feel like ties in really nicely with Kate's talk, and how economics, politics, society, communities all tie in together. And I was wondering if you'd feel comfortable to read it, or if you'd like me to read it.
Oh, please go ahead. Oh, right, do you want to?
Well, it's up to you.
Let's see you read it.
Okay, so at this moment of intense crisis, we could be forgiven for asking ourselves, how did it come to this? How could we possibly have let slip our concern for our very survival as a species? We have ignored the science that links climate breakdown directly to human behaviour. Excessively consuming, extracting, flying, waste producing. Through sheer neglect, we have allowed a disrupted biosphere to release global pandemics. How could we have carried on knowing what we knew? So what do you think is this ignored science is, and what's the missing piece here, or what are sort of the ideas you're trying to introduce?
Thanks, Zoya. And first of all, I just want to say I'm, so excited to be here for all the reasons that Amy said before. It's great to be here on this day, and at some point over the next 20 minutes, half an hour, I think I'll get to the point where I can really describe back to you what I think is happening here at Civic Square, and why in this book I talk about it as one of the core principles and formations that is occurring at this time that will be at the heart of a future social, economic, political system. So to be here today is quite moving for me, and to be able to have relationships with all of you and to hear what you're doing and what you're thinking about what you're doing is very important for the next stage of my project. So thank you for choosing that paragraph, because that's the question I think so often people ask themselves when they can see the mess that we're in. How did we get into this mess? How could I have allowed that to happen? And if you're somebody with a lot of privilege, you're thinking, how did that happen on my watch? What was I doing? And if you're somebody without privilege, probably you're thinking, how could they have done that? Right? And this is like an emotional turmoil that we're in. And when I first started writing this book, it was in fact at the moment of Brexit, and at the same time Trump had just been elected. And I had been already working with a political think tank for 10 years, trying to study and trying to improve our political system. And what I'd seen was only 2% of people, this is a bit mind-blowing, only 2% of people in our country, and between 2 and 5% across the whole of Europe, and the same in America, are members of political parties. What's happening with the other 95% of people? And, where does the power lie and where is my agency? These are the really big questions, because what I was seeing is this intense division that had occurred in our society. And I was picking out Brexit and Trump specifically, not because I'm saying one side was right and the other side was wrong, but just the phenomenon of a society so deeply divided that we were practically in the 50-50 level. How did we get to be divided at 50-50? Something must be going on here, and somebody else or something else might be in charge. And it wasn't only parts of the country or classes. In my family, we had been divided as a family. So something was like very skillfully, employing this kind of division, really deep division. And the very moment that I decided to start the alternative, in fact, was the day that Joe Cox was murdered. And I thought, this is like the extreme result of a divided society, when on the basis of one question, leave or remain, somebody had decided it was, it made sense to murder an MP. So this is like the extreme end of an extreme position. So, and when we look at the way our politics is designed, think about it now, emotionally. Whichever side you're on, 50% of the people in any of these countries is constantly invested in the failure of the other 50%. We are internally and socially and then internationally divided. Everything that we see written about is coming out of the 2% of people who are on the inside of these political systems. The media feeds on their discourse, and this idea of this constant division is the one that we live with, right? So, even the best people that I know, will talk about the other side as those bastards, right? So it's us and those bastards. And that's the life that we're living all the time. And this is where our power is. Our power as people to come together to really solve the problems it's imploding all the time. So how do we get out of this? The other big question that is being poised there is, that power feeds, as Kate has so beautifully described, on a socio-economic system that has been destroying our planet. So how did we get to buy into that? How did I become a consumer? I know, and I catch myself sometimes buying stuff I don't need and throwing away stuff that I know it has nowhere to go. So why am I doing that, even when I know? So one of the keys to this, one of the most important times that I learned recently, was my training in the human givens model, and I'm a psychosocial therapist. What does that mean? So the human givens model shows us that every human being, from birth onwards, like in the womb, we are designed to get a certain amount of emotional needs met, right? So if we can get these emotional needs met, then we will be able to survive. Now, most of us think of our needs from the baby, as physical first, just enough food and a roof over the head, and that baby's going to survive, and then as long as it survives, it's going to be able to do all the other stuff. And that, in a way, comes from Maslow's hierarchy, this idea that we are number one, material beings, number two, everything else comes after that. And that's how our political system is being designed. Okay, so a political party will say to you, it's their job to give you job, money, roof over your head, job done. Right now, look after yourselves. And we all know, and we learned so much. I learned so much today from your workshop, Kate, about how that isn't the case. How there are so many factors in determining whether or not you're going to survive as a human being that are not to do simply with having a roof over your head and enough food in your stomach. So what are these 9 emotional needs that the human givens suggests need to get met? I don't always remember the 9 actually, but let's start with attention. Everybody needs attention. If you don't get attention, you won't be fed. You need belonging. If you have nothing to belong to, you won't be able to find security. You need privacy. You need autonomy. The ability to have some sort of control over your life is absolutely essential. Thank you. It's absolutely essential to the thriving of a human being. you need to have status. Now, if status is, something that has been, in a way, people laugh at the idea that we need status, and we point out people and we associate it with ego. But if you don't have status, you won't be seen in your society, and nobody will hear what you've got to say, and then you're on the road to being excluded from that society. We need meaning and purpose. Now, if you doubt that you need meaning and purpose, look at what sometimes drives cults or drives any kind of movements. Often it's just, it's an ideal, it's something that makes your life worth living. So these 9, security, attention, autonomy, emotional intimacy, belonging, privacy, status, a sense of achievement, and meaning and purpose. Now, what's important about these 9 emotional needs is that we don't have lives in which we can get these needs met. Our lives are too dominated by work, we don't have time, we don't have space. So we're available, really, for other things getting those needs met for us. And if you look carefully, the way our businesses have designed the sales of their products, it's going straight into your emotional needs, right? So through the skilled application of advertising, for example, they've convinced us that you get your status from a handbag, that you get your belonging from a can of Coke, that you can get, autonomy from wearing this brand of Nike, So it's actually through our nervous system and the way that we're designed as human beings that we have become consumers of the very products that are, that is fueling the growth economy. We are addicted to the growth economy. And so when we ask ourselves, how did it come to this? How did I become a consumer? How can I extract myself from this? I can tell you it's not easy. It's not easy to stop buying stuff when you've got used to the fact that this gets your emotional needs met. And check yourself. I've told a few stories in the book about, how people, when they've got that gap in their lives or they feel a need for something, they'll just go out and buy something and everything will be a little bit better. Or if they're feeling that their neighbor has got something more than they have, or they're feeling a bit low in the pecking order in their gang, just the right brand will put them back in that place. So I'm not saying it's no one's fault that they're addicted to the growth economy, but I'm also saying it's not an accident. So that's kind of the state we're in. And I think that before we can begin to think about things like new economic systems, we have to think about really taking our own minds back. How do I take my mind back from this public space and begin to do things differently? That's the beginning of the journey, really.
Wow, there's just so much to unpack there. And I think recognizing what our needs are, and when we're buying, which we will, because we need to buy things to interact and to survive and to nurture ourselves and our families, just recognizing what needs we're trying to fulfill, and creating that consciousness where that consciousness may have been designed to be severed, and just trying to create that intentional psychology around it. Because how I actually discovered Kate's donor economics was through studying how psychological theories were used to grow consumer culture in the 20th century. And when you were talking about the current political landscape and the 98% of people, which is pretty much everyone, not actually being actively involved in politics, and there only being 2% of people currently involved in the political system in this country, I wondered if you have any more context of the history of how did it come to this. We can get into the consumer culture side in a moment, and I'd love to ask more about the psychologies behind that. But I'm wondering about the political sphere. How did this divide come about? What do we need to become conscious of in our politics and how our politics works?
It's part of me that really wants to get into that subject, and let me just flirt with it for a moment, right? Because historically, every institution that we have built, that we are all living in the shadow of, or that actually we're all invested in, and we don't have any choice but to use, was designed originally by men, right? And men at a time when they were alienated, from their homes, and women were in the home, right? So this is when these institutions were being built. And so there is a divide, between the political design, or the way that politics has been designed, and the way that homes and communities are designed, right? Of course, there's now a lot of, we're moving into each other's spaces, but historically, that's how it was. And the design that was there from the start, which is oppositional, to have first a party and then an opposition, means that we're sort of trapped in this zero-sum game, as Kate described very well to us. And it's particularly bad in the UK with what we call the first past the post system, which means that we don't even have any kind of proportional representation in our country. If with 5 parties, if everybody voted for one of those 5 parties, and then when we had that proportionally in our parliamentary system, then we might have a conversation. We'd have different kinds of people offering different kinds of solutions, and there'd be a conversation. It would be difficult to make decisions more than it is right now, but it would be a distributed conversation. Right now, it's oppositional. So that means anything. And I'm ashamed to see that I was part of this myself, but also right down to the local level. If one party puts something forward, the other will oppose it. Even if the thing that they put forward, it's not so bad actually. It's quite a good idea. And you'll find it now. This is a very good time now with a party that's got so much, so many seats, and has got such an advantage, that people will oppose almost anything. People that didn't vote for them, but even people within the party are looking to oppose them, whatever's being suggested. And there's not going to be much room for, that's quite interesting, let's go with that.
So it's like we're not really like thinking about the idea or like what society needs or the future. It's more just like, I oppose because you're you and I'm me.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's a painful way to be. And when you think about this moment, right? So this moment is, we're facing multiple crises, and multiple distractions. Yay!
That's the beauty of being out in the moment.
Multiple distractions, especially because you love them, right? And so you actually want to give them all your attention. And so, but anyway, let's keep going with it. It's not. So we've got I call it the I-we world axis. There's the crisis of the self, right? So the well-being of people at every level of society. So whether or not it's their well-being physically, poverty, the difficulty people have to survive and to thrive or to be healthy, but also mental health. So crisis of addiction, the crisis of mental instability, that doesn't have anywhere to go. That's the problem. I'm positing in my book that it's really an issue of psychosocial health rather than mental health. People who have mental health problems are, as often as not, part of a dysfunctional society or a toxic environment that they're working in, and that is causing their mental instability.
There's a whole context. It's not just you're ill in isolation.
Yeah, or you're ill and I'm not. That's So there's a lot of these. So the crisis of the self. There's the crisis of our communities and our society because we don't have any agency, right? So we get a vote once every 4 years. We have to vote between 2 parties mostly. And even when we do that, where's my agency as a human being? I've just handed it all over to this party, and look what this party did with my vote. And so it's created a profound disillusion amongst people in not only political parties and the political system, but in power itself. We don't feel, we never experienced, our power together because we've never come together. And then the third thing is, it's the crisis of globalization. So the crisis, when I say the crisis of globalization, or the crisis of the globe, obviously it's the environmental impact of everything that is not going well, but also there's this sense of the chaos of things that are much bigger than us, that we can't control, and we're just little pawns. You know, I find the best people, existentially feeling powerless, you know, in this system, with these institutions, and mostly, as you were talking about, Kate, as well, with this narrative. So the narrative of our powerlessness is constantly coming back at us through the newspapers that we're reading, through the films that we're watching, through the mini-series we're addicted to. You know, it's all about one person murders another, and, you know, that's what's interesting. And you, in terms of the crisis we're in, powerless. Nothing you can do. And even if you decide to stop eating meat, or you decide to stop buying stuff, so what? Right? You're not going to make any difference. So this is the narrative. This is a dominant narrative. So this idea of the I, we, and the world axis of crisis is also the axis of a new politics, right? So the I, we, worldness of a new politics has to come from a new, much more complex idea of the individual. So instead of Homo economicus, it's the biopsychosocial spiritual entity. We know that's what we are, right? I'm a complex human being, and I have to get my needs met, and I want to feel my agency, and I want to, test what creativity can. This is a huge desire from people. So that's one of the new planks, if you like, of the new politics. The second is, you need a container for that. One person waking up to what is going on and doing something different, it's hard to get traction, right? We've all done it on our own. But what you're learning here, what you're learning by being here today, is that when you do it in a container, and there's a contained amount of people, and they're all making relationship with each other, and understanding each other's perspectives, and making agreements together, within that container, you can begin to feel traction. And also, by the way, this is where you get your emotional needs met. By being part of a container like this, you get belonging met, you get a feeling of status, you get a feeling of achievement because you can see the stuff that you're doing together. There's the possibility of intimacy because you're really getting to know people in ways that you can't when you're just, in a space that's too big for you. Containers ultimately are what will incubate human agency. So without the containers, we're just in that wild world of social media, fighting with people, having an opinion. Within a container, you hear each other's opinions. You start to accommodate other people's points of view. You start to plan together, and you see the results in your own environment. You start to feel achievement. You can have status. So do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Then
I think that links into what you wrote about, like conflict transformation, or moving from conflict resolution to conflict transformation.
Yeah.
And like this whole idea of like listening and understanding the needs, and perhaps like a container being a space where you can like reach that. Like I wonder if that links for you in the same way.
No, absolutely. So it's always reminding me a bit of my past, and then because for a while I was working in conflict transformation training. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the key things that I learned, that there's a great difference between conflict resolution and conflict transformation. So conflict resolution is when two parties are seen as at the heart of a conflict, and they come together and they try to get over it together, right? And so what happens too often is that there's a compromise. It's still a zero-sum game because you need to get to an agreement. And so I'll give up this and you give up that, and we'll come to some agreement. But unfortunately, those grievances that weren't met are still lying there, and they can rise again later on. So conflict resolution, of course, is very important. We're all watching now what's going to happen to the Irish peace agreement, for example. But the things that weren't addressed are now rising to the surface, and the fact that people didn't understand how difficult it was to get to that point, now it's being threatened again. Conflict transformation is something very different. It's when you see that wherever there's a conflict, there are multiple parties. There are so many parties to a conflict. It's not just the two people who are fighting, it's their families, it's their communities, it's the way the business is run, it's the way the culture has developed the frame of this conflict. So there's so many different parties. And when you, the task of the mediator is to get to understand these parties before you bring them to a space together, right? And then it's, instead of all of those people trying to negotiate some sort of an answer, you really start to project into the future. What kind of a future do we want to build together? And, can I find myself in that future? And that's a very different process altogether. Sometimes you have the most amazing results that had nothing to do with the conflict whatsoever, but it's something that people can buy into together. And that's been the way that we've been running. We do a process called collaboratories, where we go to different parts of the UK and run this kind of process.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's like, instead of just like staying at the feud or the bickering or the differences, it's trying to like look up and imagine the future, and it's what are our visions, and what are the needs that we want to like manifest, and how can we co-create that. It's really awesome. There's a few other really, really amazing ideas. Yeah, there's loads of copies of the book, everyone, so do pick one up. So I wanted to ask you about feminizing the future. Actually, no, before we get to that, I think it's really important to talk about fractals.
Yeah.
And you've set the political landscape so wonderfully of how we got here, what the current picture is. What's your vision for how you and me and everybody that is sat in this space can reconnect with our innate agency? How can we create change? Like, what is politics to us? What is a fractal?
Yeah.
What do you mean by this?
Yeah. Okay, great. So, thanks for that question. So the fractality of our present, of this time that we're in. Okay, so my contention is that we've been in a revolution for 20 years, right? So for 20 years, really coinciding with the birth of the internet, people have had different lives. Why? Because they've had access to information that they never had before. They've had access to each other, which they never had before. They're able to mobilize in new ways. They're able to find out increasingly almost anything that they want to know, right? And also very importantly, they've seen themselves in the public space. So if you tweet out, or if you do a selfie, or if you start a group, you are seeing yourself now in the public space for the first time, and other people can have access to what it is that you just created. So I think historically, we'll see that was a huge evolutionary leap for mankind. That every human being that until that moment had so little access to information, and could only really hear what the person above them wanted to hear, suddenly has access to all this new stuff. And it's not just information, right? It's realization. When you start to hear stories from others and you get to see other people's lives, you start to get why your life is the way it is, and you see other people have got lives like you. And this is what I call the waking up process. Now, people who've been most disadvantaged, have had the most steep and extreme waking up to really being like maybe 5-10 years. It's not an accident that my life is so shit. It's not an accident that people like me find themselves in these conditions. Actually, there's a reason for that. And here it is going on here. And here's this book, and here's this video. It's like it's really extreme. And I would say that what we describe as wokeness, is the grief and the anger that comes from the people who've woken up the most sharply to their conditions and found others waking up at the same time as them. Finding the others, finding power and agency, in connecting with others in your grief and anger. And so this is actually an era that we're in, right? But even people who've had it easy are finding out stuff that they didn't know before about personal journey here about how I stopped eating meat. I mean, you've all seen the videos, of how the meat comes from a field to my plate. It's absolutely shocking, and I can't believe that I allow that, right? So it's not simply it's not only one kind of person. Every kind of person is going through a waking up period in their life, right? So it's just so, at this moment, we're in the chaos of all of that, right? So, people getting together, making protest groups, you're challenging people on the defense. I don't know what I'm on the defense about this, but I'm on the attack about that. My life is like that the whole time. So what can we do with all that chaos? So all of that chaos, that's why we started the alternative. After a couple of years doing the alternative, seeing this so clearly as we were, we also began to see that the movement of people towards each other to create these, what I call community agency networks or citizens action networks, CANs for short, right? Wherever people are coming together, it gives them a place to face this stuff with others. So ideally, if you're doing it somewhere where you live, that you can begin to have these conversations and face yourself and face the other. The conversation and the relationship making is the most important thing that we can do right now. So I call, relationship is the rebel act. Make a relationship with someone you don't know, and if you're, particularly somebody who's quite unlike you, and you are beginning to overcome the trance that we've all been in. Well, it's not just us, it's our ancestors. We've been in a trance of going along with something that we're now waking up from. Now, going back to the fractal, right? So, what the internet has shown us is that when patterns of behavior become a little bit like settled, then you can see somebody else is doing the same thing. So you begin to see that what you're doing is also happening over there and is also happening over there. Once you link into a network, you make one relationship with another person. Like I'm speaking to Andre today, listening to him talking about his creative network and the teaching he's doing. Through that, I will find out all the people you are connected to who are doing the same thing. He will know and see what I'm doing, and suddenly you'll see, oh, all these other people doing the same thing, right? This is what I call fractal reality. You're seeing the patterns of behavior everywhere, right? And some of them have got a lot in common, and some of them have got bits in common. It's not at all a uniform thing, but that's how they grow. And copying and drawing on each other's tools and practices is how things can go viral in this world. So it's not anymore like a central organizing thing where somebody makes the prototype and now I'm going to, Honda Cars makes the prototype, opens up factories around the world, and something is achieved, but mostly cars and more shit jobs, right? But patterns of revolutionary behavior, communities moving together, these can also be copied everywhere. So when we had been working for a couple of years, we started to design this ideal CAN, right? And we were doing that in Plymouth. But quite soon we saw, that we were so way behind the curve. These already existed everywhere, right? So our ideal was the collaboratory, people coming together, looking at the future, starting a citizens action network. But, we began to see that actually that's what transition towns is. They are CANs. That's what eco-villages are. That's what fearless cities are, right? Everywhere where people are coming together intentionally, these are CANs. And, that's what Civic Square is, but I would say Civic Square is high on the ambition and what I call the Cosmo Localism, right? So the Cosmo Local factor in a CAN is very important, which means how much of the global resources can you filter into your own locality? And I don't mean mangoes, from the other side of the world. I mean for example, a 3D printer, which means that you can literally make anything that anybody's making around the world. Or, a fab lab that can download all sorts of possibilities. Or, just the way people coming together at Civic Square starts to tell the story about what it's doing, resonates with people everywhere. So we started to gather these cans, and first of all, we thought we were just picking them out and saying to Rob Hopkins, "You're a can," you know. He resists the idea, you know, but that's what it is. That's what it has in common with what Imi's doing. But also, suddenly, out of nowhere, cans in Mexico, cans in Africa, cans in India. We're picking them up all the time. There's an amazing movement in India called neighborocracy, which is just neighborhood parliaments going from the local level all the way up to the national level. You know, they have their own youth prime minister, you know, and well, I can't even go into too much detail, but really sophisticated cans. And so the idea that I'm now bringing forth in my book is that the movement of cans, which can be technologically enabled. So if all of these cans were technologically connected to each other, then what you were talking about is sharing practice, sharing ideas, sharing stories. It all begins to move much faster. We're doing it at the basic level, but this is the thing that we need to move into. But then what have you got? You've got a movement, the can of cans, involving real people all over the world, right? And what I'm pointing at in my book, and it may be a step too far for most people, but I see this as a parallel political system, right? So where you've got the current political system, which is the party politics, and then you've got the people's political system, which is the can of cans, which could result in a people's parliament in all sorts of, you know, in countries. It could be served by citizens' assemblies, people's assemblies. There's so much there. But when these two strands move into partnership with each other, we've really got a chance.
This is what I find so exciting about your work and your concept of fractal political movement, is that it orchestrates the social level, like normal people, all of us, who politics actually depends on us and our opinion, public opinion. And so remembering that, creating that agency on a local level where we can see it and where we can enact it and where we can have relationships, foster relationships, and it makes sort of moving the shifts into the donut economics and into the ways that we want to live in the future. It just sort of creates a sort of framework and a structure to be able to enable that. And I think it gives you a lot of hope for, you know, how some of these transformations might happen. And I realise time is ticking, and there's...
Can I just say on the end of what you just said, is that I think that moment where Joe Cox was murdered, and I come back to that moment for myself, when I felt so, whatever we do, you know, whatever the good people think they can do, we can still be sabotaged by this system. Somebody else can divide us and turn us in against ourselves. So that's really the, you know, just to add back to what you're saying, and so the urgency, moving into that space, you know, is kind of now.
The urgency sort of this ties in perfectly, because one of the first few ideas in your book that took me, you know, I'm still absorbing it, is the way that you divided. Well, you wrote response - ability, and with Kate's principles, we were thinking about nurture human - nature, and in that context, thinking about the dash representing perhaps a spiritual link or some sort of connection that's been severed with human nature. And I just thought, you know, the way that you broke down the word responsibility feels really humanizing, and for me it invites you to meet people where they're at, which is what Daniel talks a lot about. So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts, feelings around responsibility are, and what it means for you.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that today when Imi was talking about starting this book club, you know, and about how our education system really isn't geared towards developing responsibility. You know, so much of our education system is us downloading the system into our heads and becoming the carriers of that system, right? And, you know, which leads us to jobs and industry and this growth economy. Whereas if we are being taught organically from the word go to become response able to respond to our circumstances. So whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, we're able to respond to that. So I would say at the core of any can is a learning club. And the learning club is, sometimes the big ideas, like donut economics, is a big idea and one that we all want to be re-educated into. But there's also things like, how to feel more confident, how to be able to speak up, how to get your needs met, in a healthy way. So at the moment you're getting your needs met in an unhealthy way. How can you get them met? There's so many aspects of what can be learned, and I would say that all of us, I don't think there's anyone who isn't ready for an upgrade, on their capacities and their skills for this 21st century. There's so much that we don't know. Once you start to think from a futurism point of view, what is out there in the science right now? There's technology that could take us over in the next 10 years. We need to get engaged with it. We need to understand what it is that is being used. We must understand how money is made, how it might be made in the future, or how an algorithm is created. There's so much that we need to understand, and what better than to be learning actively with your community in this kind of organic way. Apart from that, even in a room like this, there's going to be, every one of you has got something to teach. So the organic nature of, teaching each other what we know, appreciating each other, that all of that, the learning club is absolutely at the heart of the can. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much for reminding us of the value that each of us can bring, and that we all have innate wisdom simply through being and simply through experiencing, and reminding us of the unlearning and relearning, that the shifts that need to continually be happening, emerging in fractal ways. And I realise we're tight on time, and I do want to open up for questions, but I've got one more burning question, which the neighbourhood donut team at Civic Square will know. When we did our first sort of brainstorm on Miro around, the donut moving into 21st century economics, just thinking about the 20th century model, which is the current system, right? Which comes from such a scarce view or image of human nature, human psychology. Basis is Freud, social Darwinism, competition, ego, narcissism, destroy your neighbor before they destroy you, buy into a version of yourself that doesn't exist, that can never be fulfilled, buy this thing not because buy this thing because it's been made by someone in a factory who's been treated badly somewhere far away, because you'll be inflicting harm on them. These are the sickening psychologies of the last century. And as a social spiritual therapist, someone with so much intuition and understanding of the human psyche, we were trying to imagine what is the model of human psychology for the 21st century. How are we, what is the place of abundance that we can come from? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No pressure.
It's a big one. It's actually been burning in my heart for a long time, and I'm glad I've got someone I can ask. But also no pressure.
Zoya, you're already that person. What do you mean? You're already that person. You don't need to become another person. To me, this is the key thing. Is that we begin to understand that the story of scarcity is just a story. You think you don't have power, you do. You think there are no resources, there are. You think it's not possible to change the future, it is. It's that's the waking up. and you wake up to that, and then you invest in that. Which one are you which truth are you investing in day to day? The one you're reading in the paper, or the one that you know in your heart? I mean, I know the minute I saw you, I know you're enough. You're more than enough. You're more than enough. I'm happy to meet you. There's nothing there's nothing I'm going to suggest to you that you are lacking. Nothing.
Oh no, it wasn't to do with me.
No, I'm not. No.
So much power.
No. I'm not saying it is to do with you.
This is the
but
innate...
it is to do with the way we feel about ourselves as a society. That we've, I mean, it's in the book actually, right? So I was in Indonesia in the 1980s. Great line. But my father's Indonesian. There was a reason for me being there. And I'd been drawn to this group of Buddhist anarchists. I can't think of a better way to describe them. And we were moving around the country, and I couldn't understand Indonesian. I didn't even know what they were saying, but I was just there as a journalist. I want to write about this phenomenon, right? And we went from village to village, and this is at the time of military rule. They were just getting their parcels of food every 2 weeks. So it wasn't unrest, it was a kind of contentment. But, the young people especially were, they had no point to their lives and they were unhappy. And what happened is that we'd arrive in one of these villages, and then I'd listen to this guy who was a kind of an uncle, but in the way that Imi would understand uncles, it's like a friend of a family who's become an uncle, right? And I was he was the guy that I was writing about, and he would sit like this. I'm a bit freaked out, as you realise, but like this, and start to speak. And it was a sort of I knew it was some form of a Buddhist talk he was giving, but he kept saying, Ada. Ada. And this word Ada, I had to know what the fuck does that mean, And when I translated it, it's nothing more than, it's there. It's there. Right? The thing you think you're missing, it's there. And when I could see that people were puzzling, they were like a little bit annoyed, And then we would leave, and then the only thing was it's an open invite. You want us to come back? We'll come back, when you. And what would happen? The pattern was we'd go somewhere 6 months later or so. We'd be invited back, and when we came back, you would find, every time somebody had started to grow vegetables, somebody had built a road, somebody had moved out of their parents' house and into another house. Stuff had started to happen, and it wasn't just that mostly it was because they got into the groove of thinking they could do something that before then they hadn't thought. But it was also because they were talking to each other with that idea, they were reading a lot, doing a lot of study together, and something started to build. This kind of human energy agency was building there, and they started to do stuff. Now, I left Indonesia, and it just woke something in me.
Such a lovely connection, because I remember reading it in the book, and there's like you describe your story and experiences there so wonderfully, but it's so nice to hear in person, and it makes a lot more sense with you saying it. It's in German, it's like doch. It's like yeah, but no, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Doch.
Doch. Yeah.
Okay.
Imi, I saw your hand up, and I would love to open up to everybody here. If you'd like to ask Indra anything, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Indra. It's lovely chatting to you.
Yeah, no, lovely.
I was just going to add something on when you were saying about it's there and the abundance. I was on a call a few days ago where a bunch of people were like, half of them were arguing for degrowth and the other half were arguing something else. They all cared about the same thing, like we need a transformation, and they were all locked in this conversation about what it was and what the definition was. And I mean, Kate wasn't there, but somebody was like fighting for donut, and somebody was like it's degrowth, and I was just watching, because I was like, you're all literally trying to say the same thing, and it was just interesting to watch, even on the sort of movement of where there was lots of people, they couldn't even find the space to come together, and that just spoke to some of the division that you were talking about, and the lack of nuance of how we could find spaces between that. But there was another interesting moment where the guy who came up with the Free Horizons network, Free Horizons framework, Bill Sharp. Bill Sharp, he just came in and said, just really quietly, he was just, look, arguably we've been in degrowth for the last 200 years because nature and living systems are abundant, they thrive, that's what they do naturally. And what we've been doing is just been in degrowth, where we've been pulling and burning it to the ground. And that actually just, if we were to understand and reframe what's been happening, even the way you're all talking amongst each other in this progressive economics movement, it would help us all to like really ground in something else, which is that if we return to some of what is inherently spiritually, metaphorically, literally under our feet, all around us, and return into relationship with that, we would understand that we've actually, like, that's what we've been doing, and when we think about growth in really healthy ways, it will come to us from there. So it was just really interesting, and he'd like sat back for ages and then just unmuted, spoke for like a minute, and then everybody just retreated. You could literally see everybody like rolling back. And I was just there in the chat going, "Go on, Bill!" But it was, I didn't even know. I mean, I didn't know who he was. But what I meant by this was just this idea of just stepping back for a moment, taking a breath, and looking at the stories, the models, looking externally for all of this, and just like that grounding, which I just came to me because this week is really about grounding ourselves back into like what's not serving us and what is, and how do we need to think. And I just thought that was really powerful, Indra.
Thank you. And well, just to build on what you're saying, I mean, sometimes I find that in the conversation you'll hear me saying a lot of stuff around attitude and feeling, but this Can's movement, you know, is real, and giving rise to, you know, across this movement, what I would describe as a non-economist, a fourth sector economy, right? So in my mind, we're adding together cooperatives, commoning, even B Corp, everything that comes out of, you know, like creative economic engagement, entrepreneurship. You know, there is a fourth economy that is arising directly from the Can's movement. And so it's not, you know, you can engage at any point of this as a new politics. It may not even look like a new politics to you because it has this new system upholding it, right? But I really encourage any one of you, if there's even a tiny bit that you're interested, go look into the internet to find more about it. Not just in my book. You won't find it all in my book. I'm just pointing at what we've seen over 4 years arising, because it's real. It's just that you're not really reading very much about it. And the thing that I'm most keen on with the parallel system, the CANs, and even something called, which is another possibility, the Global Virtual Party, is that when people are looking for belonging, and they may not have a CAN, they want something to belong to. They want to believe that they're part of this. What I love, Imi, while you were tweeting out over the last couple of days, saying this is a new movement, people want something to belong to that they can actually trust and invest in and see real outcomes from. That time is now. We really can't. I'm going to go Imi, go Imi plus Kate. You know, we can't wait any longer for something to make itself clear, because I can tell you that people are plotting right now to really take advantage of all this localism and turn it to their profit. That's hovering right around you now. Localism is like a thing. A lot of people have got their eyes on it. It's going to be branded by somebody in a certain way. If you don't own it, somebody else will own it for you. And that's the moment we're in right now.
Kat, did you have a question?
Thanks, Indra, for coming and talking to us. It's fantastic to get to hear in person. Such a privilege as well, after all, so many Zoom calls. I mean, part of the reason I joined Civic Square, my question, is because, I think people need the tangible thing to go, that's the example, that's what's possible, and I think that's the beauty of the project that I get to be part of. It's very lucky. But I was wondering, in your book, whether you talk about how we can help other people wake up. So people in that first system that you talk about, like people in investment banking and people in politics. Like, is there any chance to wake them up?
Everybody's looking at Jen.
Look at Jen as well. But like, what's the like? I'm always thinking that they have the power. The system works for them. They don't have an intention necessarily to change it.
Yeah.
So can they wake up basically?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, or two things. Firstly, they are waking up. And secondly, it's unlikely that if you target them to wake them up, it's unlikely that is going to be the way it can sometimes work, but that's not the way I don't think I woke up that way. I woke up feeling it was my realization. I had to kind of own it in some way. But there's also something very mercenary about the way that business and politics works, which is politicians want your votes and business wants your money, right? And that's in a way where you can, you're thriving and you're growing a new economy is actually going to shift the whole system, including those people. So an example of that is already happening in the Southeast Asian stock markets now. They've reset, I've got to get the right language for this because it was just a story that I read, but they've reset their parameters because they've understood that a green economy is the way that the people want to go. And so they're picking up on that because of the ways that people are spending their money and behaving, right? So now that's not here yet, but it's something that's quite distinct in the Southeast Asian stock market. It's reshaping itself right now, and it's not because they all suddenly awoke one morning and saw the light. It's because they see the way things are going, and that's really the possibility of our power. And if you there's one more distinction I want to make, and that's between hard power and soft power. And hard power is basically guns and money, the kind of power that we know that governments and institutions have. They have the money, they have the guns, they can coerce us, right? But soft power is, as we've discussed before, is the power of narrative, and it's the power of attraction. So this is a term that was coined by Joseph Nye back in the 90s, when he was talking about why does America not have to worry even after it lost a huge war to the smallest country in the world, right? And that was Vietnam, right? So America's capital, and self-image in the world was crumbling because it lost the war to a bunch of guerrilla fighters in Vietnam, But Joseph Nye was the person who persuaded Bill Clinton and others, you don't need to worry because America always has more soft power than anyone else. And what is soft power? It's the American dream. It's the story America can tell about itself. Americana, exactly. So we all, people think that, in America, anybody can become president. They proved that to be right. And, but also that, that everybody has a nice apartment to live in. That's what Hollywood kind of peddles, and that family is everything and the good guy, and everybody has this thing called common sense. This is a story about America that people buy into, so they go to America or they listen to American stuff, and through that relationship America has with people, they can send their influence, right? So actually the things that America does get sent down this relationship with people. So the power of your attraction is very important. It doesn't mean you have to be something as large as America. Another example, perhaps not such a nice one, when ISIS was first formed, it was a small group of young men actually, but they had the power of spectacle. They released videos that got attention from the entire world, and in a very short space of time they were changing the foreign policy of major countries. That is also soft power, right? So it's a battle of soft power as much as it is hard power, but the story you tell about what you're doing, and again I think the way because I watch you do your social media, the story you're telling is important, and how it reaches people and how they hear it.
Well, chief storyteller over here needs that round of applause. My timeline's chaos, but this one over here
Right.
is the magician.
There you
magician behind the story of the last many years.
Yeah.
Quietly in the background, and we've also got some new storytellers, Zoya, and I don't know where Sana's gone, but Sana's just joined our team today, and Charlotte. So yeah, the power of stories has been how we built the hub, how we built TEDx, how we struggled like those terrible days of, it was interesting that when Brexit happened and in the horrid days after the merger of Joe Cox, and what that meant for so many reasons, including that it was a woman, including it was to do with what she stood up for. Like, we found that a lot of people just turned up at the hub. I remember getting there the day of the result of the vote, and the pub was packed, and people were like, I don't know why we're here, but we think that this is where we're going to feel better. So obviously we put the coffee on, and we just got on with it. But I think in that moment I realised there is a power in that, and then but particularly the story part, I think, has been become more and more obvious, led very, very, very visionary leadership by Bing, and the role of artistry and creativity and narrative has led to seeing that as a really big investment. But I don't want to put you on the spot, Jen. But I did want to. But I am going to put you on the spot because you can't come this far without maybe putting you on the spot. But I do think that some of that, a lot of people, we have loads of a beautiful movement, and then you'll get people to go, but yeah, when I go to work in the morning, or when I'm talking to investment bankers or investors or whatever. And I wondered if you wanted to just share a little bit of your reflections on the work that we've started together, that maybe is the other side of that story, some of the real technical, straddling those two worlds. And even just in your own words, it would be lovely. This is Jen, the CEO of 30 Person. She is not an investment banker the way we were all pointing out, and she's been a wonderful investor in helping us transition from Impact Hub to Civic Square, but also more recently as a really deep collaborator on that finance story and what finance is serving. And perhaps you might want to tell a short news story on that as well.
Okay, thanks. I guess, being part of a philanthropic institution, we are in the thick of, we're part of the old system that can see the visionary leadership of others, wanting to bring it out, but we're so riddled by patterns of replicating these horrible top-down power dynamics. So I live this day in, day out, and I guess when you were asking your question, how do you change my face started crinkling because I was like, it's so hard. And the other day I was just desperate for some, I guess it's book club, and I got that book, How to Win Friends, and I started looking at it, I started reading it, and then one of the things was just smile, and I was just this is not helping me. And again, a book that everything in that for me works maybe if you already hold privilege and power in the system, and it was just that was not a helpful tool in that moment. But this question of how changing people, I sitting with that so much at the minute, because it's just so hard. And I know that sometimes I think there's an emotional response to need to be when someone says something and you just want to, there is the angry typing and critique it, and I just, for me, particularly when you do that on your own, as you were saying, it doesn't do anything other than tire you maybe, and so building kind of practice and discipline around sitting with tensions and finding other ways to surface them and work through them, like that group you were talking about, Amy. And I just feel as an individual anyway, we just haven't got the capacities and skills. I know you say it's there, and it is there, and I trust that we'll learn them, but those behaviours and skills and understanding just have been so underdeveloped in us, and reaching out for guidance about how do we navigate, and I think the power of attraction. Because sometimes I want to write quite an angry narrative really about where we sit in the system, and then I think, but what does that serve? What will that serve? Will that, but then at the same time, who says it then? Does anyone say it? And so I don't have a particularly, that question I was that's a very topical question in my head, but thanks to the wisdom of others and collect, we can kind of work on this together and recognise that we're probably all part of these patterns, and there's this going on for everyone. We can all just just we're all sitting with a lot of this and the tensions, wanting to work through tensions, and how do we do that well, and with kindness. And so I don't know if that's true. I didn't talk at all about the partnership that we're part of, but in a sense there are tensions in that partnership, and this trying to work through from different perspectives of the system, kind of holding to a core integrity, which is really what Civic Square bring, and trying to sort of hold that and not have that be corrupted. So yeah, that's just what came to my head when you put me on the spot there with me.
No, absolutely, and it's just a good moment to thank you, Jen. But also just to say, like, some of you I know in the room from your careers and things like that have talked about this idea of like rewiring the capital, and how does everything that we dream of match how systems are working. And so there is an early provocation piece for those of you who are bonkers about the detail. Go and have a look into that, because we'd love to also create other like sub-communities thinking in different ways. The blog's up on our Medium and their Medium, and we'll be doing way more on that over the next few months. But I just think it's interesting that point of like that space between all the ground up, and then like where does it meet the current system and do enough and like start to shift or acknowledge
and meet it in a way that is service to the can, rather than like you say, starts to try and dictate to the can what it needs to serve itself.
Do you remember that moment? You weren't in the workshop today, but there was a moment when Kate suddenly turned the thing upside down, right? And she said, we're all trying to get more matches because we think getting more matches is the thing. But what if that, instead of that being money, that was debt, right? And then suddenly we don't want the matches anymore, right? We just wish we hadn't got all that much debt, right? And it's knowing that, it's like understanding the dynamics of a story suddenly flipping over, right? So when Buckminster Fuller said, don't bother fixing the old system, build the new one that makes the old one obsolete, that was such permission. I don't know how many people feel that, and like, okay, I can just do the thing, create the fractal, draw it out, tell the story, but make it real. So don't. If you catch yourself saying we could do this, or we want to do this, or we need to do that, that's not it. It's got to be, we are doing this. This is happening. This has been created. It has to be a story of something that is happening, and then, really, it's almost to you then when you're working in your place of toxic, reality old system, how much of yourself is aware of everything else that is happening outside of that space where you're doing your battle. I think that makes a huge difference. For example, one can is not going to change the world. 100, 1,000, and hundreds of thousands, that's going to have an impact, and knowing that you don't have to make that happen, but it's already happening. And really, it's for you to be open to your connection with those things. So one of the things I want to talk to Imi about, and I'm saying it here, is, how do the cans connect with each other? Is that the time? Are we now ready for African cans to meet and be in conversation and tell the story of stories with the Indian cans, with the, South American, with the English, with the Scottish, that story of connecting up stuff. That once that starts to happen, and it's not really happening yet, it's happening in our room every 2 weeks.
I'm hogging up a lot of time, but I do want to say a couple of weeks ago I was on a call that Deal hosted with Ubiquity University, where I was at the stage with all of this work of loads of stuff that we'd done within the neighbourhood donut, but I couldn't, like, what's the next leap? How do we commit? How, like you said, we couldn't say we could do this, we could do that. How do we commit? And I was on a call with Juan Carlos from Curaçao and Amsterdam, and someone from Brussels. And anyway, cut a long story short, they were sharing their stories in really powerful ways. And like, I literally put down that call and set up this week to say, well, we just have to commit now. So we have to commit. There's like no way. We said we could do this, or we sort of could do that, and and that's happening in some of the other, Jen's laughing because we're kind of committed to a bunch of other stuff as well. So I think the power of it is incredible. I've just got one last question before it, like, please, like, wave your arms around if you've got anything, but could you just speak to what is the role, and we haven't talked about this before, this isn't rehearsed or anything, I just wanted to ask, what's the role of crisis in all of this? So, like, we talk about, like, you know, there's all these connected movements and then they can, like, flip the reality, but what's the role of crisis? And I know that, you know, those of us from the Global South particularly will know that there's islands from where our parents or grandparents are that are going underwater and all of that. So, like, I say this still, what's the role of crisis in the West, or in, like, more privileged societies? What's happening in Germany, or the pandemic last year that suddenly shifts everything, or the temperatures in Canada? What's the role of when, like, a big shock and crisis comes in your... I've heard this answer to this question from lots and lots of different people, and they all have different things, but what happens when it all falls apart? And then what is the role of this type of work and organising and thinking? And you know, I've got loads of opinions on it, but I'm just interested in what you think, Indra.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a huge question because, you know, I think personal crisis, I think global crisis, I think, you know, let's just start with those two. I mean, I would say that my life is, you know, arose from facing crisis, you know. So I didn't realize that I didn't realize that I had a crisis at 3 because my parents immigrated from Holland to Britain, and I now understand that had a lot of effect on me. But the real crisis that I experienced was when my brother died in a car crash when I was 11, and it was I do write about it in the book, but and I sometimes still go back to it because it was the moment where my idea of where power lies was completely shattered, because I was a young convent school child and I prayed to God all night to save my brother, and it didn't happen. You know, he died. And now this is not a comment on God at all, because everyone has a personal relationship with God. But as an 11-year-old child, I had nowhere to go. I was totally, like, lost, and I think I dissociated from reality to the extent that I found myself over the next few years in a place, you know, in my head where I could still be with my brother, you know, and I could still be with over the next 7 years, I had 8. My mother had 7 brothers and sisters. 8 brothers and sisters, 7 of whom died of cancer while I was a teen. So, you know, this question of where is my powers, where is my agency, what is making this happen, you know, was my driving force. That was the thing that drove me all through and I made up my own religion. I had my own religion that I made up, you know, which I later discovered was Buddhism, but I didn't know Buddhism existed at that time. You know, I would say it was the grounding of my life, that kind of personal crisis. And I had another great leap in my life where I nearly died of pneumonia, and I didn't know I was dying, and I only found out afterwards that I was in a really dangerous place, but I didn't know that. But it took me a year, like long COVID. It took me over a year to recover, and I had to push myself away from being totally dependent and unable to do anything for myself. So that's personal crisis, but I learnt everything that I know now from those two things. I would say that from the point of view of the global crisis, I'm watching, I have family in Jakarta. Jakarta itself is sinking, right? You have to rebuild Jakarta, which they're doing, right? But they're also, you know, finding, if I'm listening to them, they really urgently want attention from us because they are finding their way out of this problem. It's their own way. I would say the same of my relationship with the small Indian slum groups. It's their word for where they are. It's not a word I would use. And what they are generating there for the first time. They want me to know what they're doing. It's not that they want me to help them. They want me to share what they're doing around the world because they are responding to the crisis in a different way than I could have imagined. Now, I'm not saying that's the whole story. I'm just saying crisis plays out in different ways. The crisis of the privileged classes, that's mostly what we're talking about. And there's part of me that says, let's do it. Let's be in crisis. Let's not know, because it's our responsibility. You know, we in the privileged, nations, we caused most of these problems physically. You know, we've caused the destruction physically. We were the colonialists, originally. So let's take it on as a crisis for ourselves. Let's do that with gusto, right? Let's own it. But not everybody will, and a lot of people didn't profit. You know, for example, there are a lot of young, for example, now being targeted by a lot of people. You know, the young white male, let's say, is the target, right? But the young white male, I've got one of these young white males. You know, is my son. You know, how do they relate to the crisis, and what's their role in the crisis? I mean, if you're living in a privileged way, the way I am, and there's education, I think the crisis is the best gift. You know, my son is growing up better than I did because he gets that we're in a crisis. I didn't get it. And, you know, he's becoming a young man of integrity. He has no problem giving way to women because he knows historically women have been disadvantaged. I mean, he's a vegan. I'm sorry, I don't want to build him up too much, but, you know, he's a pain in the arse as well. But, you know, but I think there is a way to use the crisis, but also to remember that as soon as you can have that conversation, you're in a different place. If you're talking to someone who's really unable to do anything then that's the person you have to help. That's the person you have to include. That's the person you have to be thinking about when you're planning. You know, but everyone who can be in the conversation of what can I do with this crisis is somebody who can use the crisis. Absolutely. Now, I'm not sure that you can hit racism on the head at any point. It's really whether or not you can awaken everyone in the place where you are to own racism themselves, right? So rather than organize who should do what or who has to apologize to who, do you have the tools and the methods to evolve the culture within that can, wherein everyone owns racism. Now, that may not be that easy to understand, but let me give you an example of what happened with this, with George Floyd and the whole of that post of that. I think it was different from previous to that because, and even in my own relationship with my best friend is a black activist in America, and we always had. I'm always been, in awe of her work. You know, she's got a medal from the White House. She does incredible work in prisons. But it's often been a point where I've said to her, stop lecturing me, or there's something that pushes back on her. And after that global event, I had to look again at myself and how much I was still allowing this to happen. That somehow in myself, as part of the culture, not consciously but unconsciously, I was still allowing racism. And I think that's the shift that a lot of people are still not making. That they can see it as an issue that's outside of themselves and they don't see it as an issue that's inside of themselves. And that's where exactly what a can create is that level of we all own the problems of society here. Does that make sense?
Or a structure of like hierarchy around which this country is organized.
Yeah, we own it. We don't just point at it, we're owning it.
Yeah.
I'm playing in this structure. I'm allowing this structure. It doesn't mean that I can fix it today. I can't just make it right, but I know I'm colluding with this thing. And so me shifting on the inside starts to make the shift happen. And then you start to see what other people are doing and you start to see the things that are disadvantaging other people. But it has to be, if you want a one sort of solution answer to how does a can address that, I would say this: it develops this kind of culture and the facilitation and the methods and the learning to own the problems of society and stop putting them outside of the can. Stop saying we're fine here, it's bad out there. That would be a mistake. You know, we've come together because we own it, and we're going to do it ourselves.
I think returning to agency is a really beautiful way to wrap up this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Indra, and to Imi and Nikki for making this happen, and to everyone for being present and bringing yourselves and your energy and your questions. I realise it's been a long day, so the music and
thank you.
Your
Beautiful interlocutor.
I came with my dad.